Hello and welcome to the CS4 interview. Joining me this week is Rachel Armstrong from the University of Greenwich. Rachel, welcome.
Hello.
Thanks for coming. Now, your talk title, A Hitchhiker's Guide to Complexity, a great title, and also one that seems quite apt because you, at one point in time, you were practicing medicine in New Zealand. Now you're finishing a thesis on architecture in London. So has that been a progressive journey intellectually or geographically? Or have there been a period of some moments of epiphany when you realise this is what I should be doing?
I've definitely had a couple of moments of epiphany, and I guess my decisions make sense in a retrospective view. You know, obviously, whilst I was exploring, I guess, the questions that were bothering me, when I tried to articulate what my grand plan was, I think it probably wouldn't have made sense to most people. But essentially, I guess I would describe myself as it's probably not the right word because the definition is so narrow, but I'd consider myself as a synthetic biologist. When I was about 5 years old, and my earliest memories are digging down into the mud and actually trying to work with the creative force that was, you know, in the garden. It was permeating everything. And the way that I responded was to try and build little communities for creatures in the garden, because I wanted them to get along better together. You know, I had this thing that, you know, if I could shape the mud this way and I put a jam jar there and I put sugar and salt and water here, then, you know, it would sort everything out. Of course it didn't. It made messy experiments. My mother used to come along and she'd clean up my mess every evening. And I guess the thing that stays with me was that, you know, my mother came along and cleared up the mess. You know, Mother Nature, you know, tries to clean up our mess at you know, regular intervals, but doesn't always manage to get there. And so I guess it's incumbent upon us to clean up our mess. But essentially my passion was the kind of the design and making with the living substrates. And I became a doctor because the only thing that you could design and engineer with that was living at the time was either plants or people. Biology was very much a retrospective pursuit. You know, it's the just so story, I think, is what Richard Lewington would call it. You know, this tiger's got its stripes because, and then we give a traditional logical narrative that maybe intertwines genes with environmental adaptation to justify the existence of tiger. And personally, I don't think nature is quite so rational or logical as that. And I think we impose an awful lot of rationality on the environment around us. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any meaning. I just don't think it's rational. But working in medicine was the only way that I could work with living things. And I guess then my first experiments, really, in terms of design and thinking about, I guess, optimizing or exploring other ways of being was actually through medicine, through the human body. And when I was a medical student, I went on a sabbatical to Pune in India, and I worked in a leprosy colony. And I was really profoundly moved by that experience because people who had, I guess, bodies that didn't work the same way as mine, managed to restore their life in a holistic way, and I mean a kind of an integrated social, physical and healthy experience of being alive, by living in a community where they had very simple technologies where they could get rid of foot drop by putting leather straps on the front of their feet, or nasal molds up into the cavities in their upper palate, because of course leprosy would eat into the cartilages, so you lose your upper teeth. And these very simple interventions and the way that this restored some kind of balance, you know, a different world, a different way of being to the one I was familiar with, really made me think very deeply about what Western medicine was trying to achieve, which in some ways was very mechanical. You know, the human body, you know, through Gray's anatomy had a standard, and if you deviated from that, you had anomalies. You know, and effectively, when you actually thought about it, we were all very anomalous, and nobody really conformed to the anatomical standards in this book. And I guess my second point where I decided to find a different route to explore the questions that I had about standards, about the contingency of our being, and the meaning that is in the environment that gives our life purpose, was when I came across the work of Helen Chadwick at the Barbican Arts Centre. I was a junior doctor at the time, and I guess I've been working a lot of hours. I mean, we were doing regularly over 100 hours a week, and I think after about a year, 18 months, I was getting, I guess, exhausted and despondent, and kind of had this big, what's my life about set of questions that I was trying to resolve. And so I used to go for walks, alongside rivers, or read papers, or explore magazines that I knew nothing about the content, autocar. And effectively I wanted to go to a concert at the Barbican because I wanted to immerse myself in music. And I ended up walking past a gallery where it was a foyer gallery. And there was this glowing presence on the wall that kind of just drew me in. And it was because it was both familiar and strange. It was a light box, and in front of the light box, which is essentially the way that we would look at an X-ray on wards with. So you put up a film and you'd be able to see the details of an X-ray. But instead of having an X-ray on this box, there was a picture of a pair of hands holding this brain, and it was cut out in this oval and mounted on this like velvety background. And I couldn't tear myself away from this. I felt compelled to find the author of this picture, because I responded to this beautiful composition by trying to diagnose it. I mean, I had no ability to appreciate art without my medical framework. And of course, with a medical examination, after your initial looking and I guess sensing the person in front of you, you look at the hands. And when I looked at the hands, I noticed that there were dents in the nails. And I suddenly became aware that this person had a special condition called koilonychia, which could indicate chronic disease. And so there I was diagnosing a picture, trying to find the artist. I guess I must have seemed quite unusual at the time. But fortunately, the gallery director put me in touch with Helen Chadwick, and I went over to her house. She invited me into her home, I ended up doing this very primitive clinical examination across this kitchen table, where I looked at her hands and started to ask her about her health. And she promised me she'd go and see her doctor because I was expressing concern. But she realised that I was speaking really awkwardly, like a doctor does. And she wanted to actually use that in her artwork. So we then started corresponding, and I would diagnose her artwork and she would repoeticize it. And so I kind of became immersed then in this, I guess, an attempt to find a way to explore the two cultures. C.P. Snow's idea that there are such historical differences, and I guess internal vanities within arts and sciences, that there is a divide between them. And yet there was, between us, even though we were that very different, we actually were compelled to work together. So we spent quite a while, looking at medical specimens in museums that she really shouldn't have access to because they were really only for doctors. And going to science parks where we'd explore things like, we saw Vanessa Penrose's tessellations, which were at the Oxford Science Park. And we started to talk about virtual embryos, but essentially the conversations were really productive. There was an interesting fusion of language, of ideas, and even though I guess the only real work we produced were essays for catalogues, the actual exchange was an extremely valuable one, and it led to me then working with and looking for work with people like Orlan, who's the French performance artist who used cosmetic surgery to radically change her appearance, for an artistic proposal which kind of wanted to approximate her internal character with her external character. And she did that using new technologies, which at the time was morphing. so she morphed her face together with 4 great beauties in painting, so Mona Lisa, Diana, Venus, these all, Europa. So these all came together to create this portrait that she then set about to implement physically. And I guess for me, this is where the origins of this interest I have between complexity and the physical world, really came from. How do you take a psychological interior, move it through a virtual space, and then reincarnate it in flesh? And that's exactly what Orlan's work embodied. But it wasn't even just that. I think it was also the politics, in the sense that Orlan managed to gain access to a traditionally scientific medical space, being a performance artist who now commanded a surgeon to embody these changes that she desired. And she did it in a very burlesque, performance-based way. And I've actually never seen anything like this since then. I think the medical profession has probably had a lot more kind of tight regulation in terms of what is possible and what's not possible. But she was really working at the frontiers of what was possible. And I guess it was only possible because of advances in anaesthetic, which meant that she could stay awake during the performance. And so then I also worked with Stellark, who is like an Aussie performance artist, who was looking to, I guess, make his body more mechanical and virtual and more like, I guess, Ray Kurzweil idea of what a singularitarian might look like as they make that transitional upload from being human flesh to the machine. But that was Stellark's work at the time, and he was looking for help with what he called a soft prosthesis. He wanted a third ear that he originally wanted sighted on the side of his face, but that would paralyze his facial nerve. And so I introduced him to plastic surgeons, and eventually, 7 years later, he got a third ear that was built using tissue culture, and then grafted onto his arm. And initially, it had a Bluetooth implant, so that when, say for example, he had a speaker in his tooth, you could speak to him on the internet, and he would be, if he opened his mouth, you could hear him speaking with your voice. So essentially, these sound kind of, outrageous and provocative, and yes, they were. But the idea that was being challenged at the time was about identity. How much how corporeal is identity? Can we do without the body? And if we can't, what is the meaning that is ascribed to our being of its configuration? And I guess this is what really formed the background to my current work, which is actually not so much body-centered. And I guess I started in that place because I was a doctor. But I was actually very interested in the other part of the Darwinian equation, which is how does the environment impact on our bodies? And from a medical perspective, the only way we really consider environment is in terms of public health. So since about the 1830s, there's really not been a radical new engagement between medicine and environment. And yet, we know that our cities are environments that deeply impact on our well-being and our psychological welfare. And in some ways, medical projects that do look at psychology of buildings, it's still very medicalized. I wanted to, again, just like I did with the body, to actually engage with design and environment, and I guess ask, the existential questions about, that our being. What is the meaning of this? And are we working in the best possible way to achieve our visions? And so, I had to, I guess, position myself within an architectural practice, because architecture is really about the distribution of matter across time and space as part of a cultural, social manifestation. Whilst I was working with Orlan and Stellark, I'd met Neil Spiller, who was an academic working in, an architect working in cyberspace, one of the pioneers of architecture in cyberspace. And he'd invited me then to come and work with architecture students. And so what I loved about being a tutor for technical dissertations in architecture was that it was a way of trying to imagine how science fiction possibilities could be realized. And so this was, I guess, my first experience of speculative engagement with challenges. Whereas in science, you know, you set a problem that you pretty much know you're going to be able to solve, give or take. You know, and if you can't solve it, you've got to find a way to solve it. But what was nice about architecture was that, for example, a student would come and say, well, I want to design a blood bank like a leech. Fantastic. You know, what is it made of? What is it doing? How does it relate to, you know, a certain set of conditions? What its value? I mean, all those kinds of things, you know, became core to the design and, you know, potential engineering. And so I guess the engineering for architecture becomes an exercise in possibility when you think about the visualizations. Visualizations are amazing because I think if you can imagine it and manifest it as a drawing, you know, then you can actually start to interrogate it as being, you know, feasible. And so, you know, those kinds of projects that I did with, you know, Niels Spiller's students, you know, were really eye-opening in terms of thinking about the scientific method and how science works with design. And I guess the other part of this was that, you know, I'd gone to practice medicine. I'd been working in the pharmaceutical communications industry after leaving medicine once, and then leaving it again after the pharmaceutical communications industry bust with the end of the dot-com era. So I went back to medicine and got trained as a GP. But essentially these questions that I'd been able to explore really didn't go away, you know, and medical practice really wasn't the forum in which I could investigate them. So I went back into academia because I felt that I would be able to create a project that would allow me to reflect on what I wanted to do next. And essentially I came across, my questions really were about the unit of design. And I was thinking about, you know, environment, which is a living thing. It's not necessarily all of our environment is living. Some of it is definitely not alive. But things, the interesting interfaces like soils and the organisms that I was interested in when I was 5, you know, all of that was I guess you know, a living engagement with space and time. And I wondered what the unit of life was. And yet I was also aware that there was a politics with the rhetoric of DNA, that it came out of a very particular kind of philosophy and understanding of the human being as being a machine. You know, that since the, you know, middle of last century, the rise of biotechnology and computing pretty much went hand in hand. So you see a great crossover in terms of the metaphors and language that is used, you know, viruses and code and, you know, the programs, you know, all these ideas were exchanged. And so I guess nowadays we see, you know, culturally the body as being as a kind of a wet computer. And this intrigued me, but I wanted to find an element that didn't have the philosophical and political baggage of DNA, partly because DNA had been metaphorically related to selfishness. And it just doesn't work for me as an idea. You know, DNA is a molecule. I mean, you know, selfishness is a value. You know, and to load values, you know, even though it's been done very successfully and is a way of articulating a particular set of ideas, you know, I didn't want to work with something that I just carried all that baggage. And so, you know, I came to A Life 11, which was organised by Seth, and it was a last-minute thing. It was Larry Yeager who told me that it was on. I came down on a wing and a prayer and managed to get in, and I came across Takashi Ikegami's keynote and Martin Hanzik's presentation, and all of a sudden I saw an architectural proposal which was a droplet moving around in an environment in space and time. And I think later Takashi actually showed me a video where the droplet could actually make a trace. And that for me became the basic unit for design with living processes, because it started in a way that I guess we should have been starting in the 90s when we were talking about genetic modification and cloning, with the principles about ethics, morals, you know, all the things that, you know, science really doesn't like to deal with because actually it doesn't have the tool set to do that. And yet these are really key to I guess the uptake and engagement with a broader society as to what you're trying to achieve by working with these processes. Again, you know, about the meaning and the opportunities that exist in working these kinds of ways, as well as talking realistically about risk you know, about the whole framing of the kinds of challenges that we're currently facing, the kind of obstacles that we have with our current tool set, and you know, the potential for working differently with a different tool set. And so I decided then to do an architectural PhD to actually explore not the basic science so much, even though, you know, of course I want to know about the basic science, you know, and you know, after having you know, visited Klaus Peter's lab, I feel very much an amateur. But you know, actually having hands-on experience with the droplets, you know, from a design perspective, with, I guess, like I say, I mean, you know, a scientific amateur. You know, I'm not an expert in anything in particular. I have an insatiable curiosity, and you know, never stopped, you know, doing the 5-year-old thing and asking why, you know, thinking about these droplets as being architectural agents, then raise all kinds of other questions, like what are the infrastructures, what's actually the cultural and social conditions in which this actually becomes meaningful, how do we work with these, what do they do, you know, what new possibilities for existence do they raise. And I guess this is the level that I'm most excited about, because of this I guess, speculative aspect of science, which I personally think is actually part of the scientific method. You know, we call it a hypothesis when we're working in classical science. And there's a philosopher called Hans Wenger who says that actually, you know, we construct the world as if it was true, and then we retrospectively prove its truth, you know, using a, you know, set of techniques that, you know, we're damn sure are going to get there. And so for me, the speculative aspects of science become a kind of dialogue, a dialogue of possibilities that enable both science and, I guess, non-scientific communities to actually start building visions that they both buy into together. Because I think at the moment, you know, because of our industrial heritage, because of science's allegiance with industry, particularly in the 20th century. You know, before, in the 19th century, there were gentlemen scientists. You know, now, you know, I guess the image of science is, you know, a guy working in a white coat in a lab in a well-paid job in a big, you know, blue chip industry, say, for example. But you know, that's only really a style, and the way that we write science papers and tell stories about what we've done is again designed to be implemented through machines. We standardize narratives so that they can be you know, reprocessed and turned into a product. And yet, if you look at the diaries of Darwin, or if you look at one of my favourite, you know, Alexander Bogdanov, you know, he starts off. You know, he was one of the pioneers of blood transfusion, and you know, fantastic. You know, bizarre, fantastic. He did these experiments with dogs, you know, nasty. Wrote them up as kind of, I guess, documentary exposés of what he did. But then he starts to give you some philosophy about why he's doing what he's doing. And what was interesting about Bogdanov, he was a Russian scientist, so he was talking in a kind of alchemical way about the revitalizing potential of blood through cytoplasm. So before DNA was discovered, you know, scientists were actually looking for this aqua vitae. It's an old alchemical idea, but it's interesting how it was converted into a modern scientific context. So we're talking about the beginning of last century now. But after this philosophy of immortality, he then takes it into a science fiction speculative narrative between a terrestrial scientist and a Martian scientist, talking about the value of this kind of research. So I find it really entertaining to think of our practice of blood transfusion nowadays, you know, existing within such a kind of decorous practice, you know, one that has been, you know, rigorously medically tested. And I think recent results came out that actually some of the, I guess, the crazier ideas that Bogdanov initially proposed, the transferability of youth-like qualities into an old person, were actually scientifically validated, I think, in blood transfusions and in a paper quite recently. So it's very interesting, that the narratives that we use in science are really styled for industry. And I guess if that's the one thing that I'm going to, I guess, challenge today, it's I guess to free up narratives. I mean, we've had quite a struggle to get popular science accepted by peers, working in in a particular discipline, where one person finds a way of talking and communicating ideas to the public, and has to, I guess, in some people's eyes, dilute down the science by not necessarily going into the detail that they would probably go into in a scientific conversation. But that's taken quite a few popularization specialists, a bit of a campaign to get into that position, and now we accept that as being one of the skills that we can embrace. I think Wellcome's got fellowships at the moment for science communication. I think there are even degrees in Wales that you can get for science communication as a discipline. And so again, just to say that science is an evolving body of knowledge, and yes, there's a certain integrity and rigor that necessarily, I guess, frames it as being scientific. But I think it's actually more its history that frames it as being scientific. And also, I think that with complexity, because the narratives are so new, and because we actually don't have a native tool set, we're still borrowing from, I guess, what we call classical science. And we don't actually have methods of investigation to look at things like flows and processes that, over distances that, aren't perceivable at the human scale. I mean, we've got GPS, and we have technologies in place that might help us do this, but as a coordinated practice, these are more like research opportunities than they are, I guess, a research body that we can tap into to, I guess, take complexity to the next level of exploration and development into a technological realm. And I think that's where we are at the moment. I think in complexity we're caught between two realms. We're caught within the realm of the possibilities of complexity, where we look at ideas and networks and flows and relationships. We kind of understand the terrain that it's exploring, but we have to resort to empirical, and not that complexity couldn't be empirical. I think it's a different kind of empiricism. It's coming out of a biological realm as opposed to a physical realm. In other words, a non-linear realm as opposed to a realm of equilibrium. So I think this transition is, where we're using new ideas, old tool sets, and we haven't really kind of made that transition so that the investigation of complexity, not just as a science, but actually to become embodied as technology and as a I guess a cultural way of life, has actually been really accepted. And I think we're in at an amazing transition point, because I think that actually the everyday conversations we have about ecology and environment are popular narratives about complexity. I think this is just simply a matter of time, and that's why I think that when I'm talking about how science has changed its conversation, let's not call it stories as such. Stories sounds like you kind of make it off the top of your head and go, well, you like it, you don't like it. It's really about a conversation, and how we engage these conversations more broadly, particularly at a time where not only is there an internal driver for change within science and its practice itself, as we're starting to grasp non-linearity and dissipative structures and complexity, but also because there's actually an external cultural need for a new way of going about things. And I think that's where complexity is beautifully poised to sit. I mean, complexity has the potential to be the ecological science. it's not there yet, and I think that from a cultural perspective, the only alternative to the machine that culture has to make an ecological engagement is nature itself. But we don't have a technology of nature, you know, that because of the dualisms that come out of classical science, it's either technology or nature. And I think that, again, you know, with a realm of something like synthetic biology and, you know, Klaus Peter's droplets, we're actually starting to talk about a hybrid field where things are lifelike, but they're not alive. They're not necessarily DNA based, and yet they're not inert like a machine. And it's this kind of space that I think that complexity really has a chance of, I guess, proposing, first of all, as a narrative for potential change. You know, if we imagine, for example, the city of Venice could be sustainably reclaimed, or reclaimed in an environmentally positive way, using smart droplets that could grow an artificial limestone reef to spread the point load of the city, and actually the alternative right now is to raise, you know, 78 giant mechanical gates, you know, a bit like King Canute through the Moses gates. And these may potentially, you know, create tipping points within the Venetian ecology. Then, you know, now we're starting to think about choices. I mean, would we actually, you know, participate in a, you know, controlled, titrated, evaluated, you know, site-specific testing of the potential to grow this reef and have a look at impacts? Or, you know, are we going to, you know, invest in, you know, bigger and bigger barriers against nature? I mean, that's actually not a decision really for one person alone. I mean, it's not a decision for a scientist, and it's not a decision for, you know, one particular person. I think this is a cultural change, and I think it's absolutely essential to the 21st century that these, I guess, experimental spaces for dialogue, experimental spaces for actually exploring the unknown through creativity and empowerment, you know, being able to actually feel the right to engage, even if you're not a specialist, even if you don't know the first thing about complexity, and, you know, really have only heard about ecology from your mates, and you know you've got to be green and the world is dying, so, you know, you want to participate. And for me, these speculative ideas, I think they're native to complexity, because, you know, complexity, you know, can work in a predictive sense, but only to a point. You know, it exists one within limits, but we actually don't know enough about tipping points to know when actually nothing we know about the system, you know, applies anymore, and that we're really learning through experience. And, you know, maybe we will understand what a tipping point is in, you know, decades to come, but I don't think we do that right now. So there is a certain amount of unpredictability, and I also think that, you know, the ideas, for example, by Ilya Prigogine are, you know, incredibly inspiring. I think that the word that he uses, you know, the end of certainty, I think is certainly true for our century. And I think although he kind of says that, you know, the end of certainty through non-linear systems and this, I guess, relentlessly restless creative existence that we have is not necessarily a terrible thing. It has its downsides in that we don't know what's going to happen, but it has these upsides, which are, you know, creativity and empowerment. And particularly as we are in a, you know, globally secular environment, you know, I think, one, it gives us the opportunity to try and find belief systems that are integrating rather than divisive, and ways of working together when, you know, finding unity through a diverse set of practices and approaches, so that we can achieve unity through a common vision, you know, rather than everybody having to do the same thing, like, you know, get their building standards up to a, you know, particular LEED or BREAM, you know, kind of yeah, guideline or standard or whatever they propose themselves to be. So, you know, I think, you know, setting too rigid goals kind of takes away empowerment and creativity. I understand the panic about, you know, environments and tipping systems, and, you know, the catastrophic effects that we've had on our own living spaces in the 20th century. and I think from a medical perspective, you know, I think this is actually, you know, an issue for the medical profession, because this is actually going to impact on our lives. I mean, UCL did a study about climate change and medicine. And again, they did it in a very epidemiological way. You know, they started talking about, you know, mosquitoes moving from sub-Saharan Africa, you know, into Europe. I mean, we've already got malaria down in Kent. But again, you know, medicine kind of looks at environment as if it's epidemiology, and I think that there are more, I guess, intimate impacts than that. You know, about, you know, our health, for example, that the space that we're in right now is full of bacteria. I mean, you know, and how does that actually contribute to our well-being? I mean, there's a lot of interest now in biomes. And I think that's going to become a greater narrative. Mm-hmm. And that will involve, you know, the medical profession understanding more about environmental impacts on, you know, anatomy, you know, physiology, you know, psychology, and I guess, you know, the space that I'm looking for, I guess, is an expanded realm of what it means to be human. That we're not just little machines, you know, acting out the kind of classical science dream that, you know, we've got body parts that are kind of slung together, and that if one breaks down, we can just replace it. But that we're actually an integrated set of mutually dependent ecologies. That, in some ways, you know, the trees are much of our breathing system, as our you know, lung tissue is. Mm-hmm. You know, without trees, we don't breathe. And so in some ways, you know, the psychology of how we make adjustments and start to think about complexity or ecology, and I think they're almost becoming synonyms now, you know, how can that actually change, you know, cultural practice, you know, I think that the science of that, you know, the integrity and the development of technologies that help us work differently as we think differently, you know, going to be absolutely critical to this decade.
That's a tremendous answer. That's I think I may have time for one very quick, just one quick. I mean, I could have quite happily interrupted you about a million times in there, but it was also fascinating. Maybe just one thing I want to ask. Yeah. The role of narratives is really important, clearly. I mean, you've already mentioned, you started off talking about gardening. I just love the picture. Your interest in artificial life and complex systems, and I think people who deal with complex systems are quite happy with the idea that they might not be in control, but they may be performing more the role of a gardener, and that you don't grow a tree yourself, you just give it the right conditions. But when it comes to constructing things, structures that people have to live within, do you find there's a tremendous resistance to this idea that you could, that we could be so firmly embedded in things, constructed materials, that we don't really understand how they work? Do you find there's a certain resistance to that idea? And if so, do you have a particular kind of strategy to get people past that, to think about it in a different way?
I think that, you know, the way we see the world is obviously the product of centuries of cultural narratives and storytelling and expectations, and I think particularly over the 20th century and 19th century, you know, we've sought control over our environment, and we like to think of it as static, because that does give us the illusion that things are we are empowered. But I guess in some ways, I mean, I guess the narrative I would say is that actually, you know, our empowerment comes from being necromongers. You know, we've actually managed to make everything around us seem still, you know, by extracting the complexity out of it. And we get really excited when we can reanimate that by, you know, shoving huge amounts of electricity through it, and we think we're incredibly clever doing that. And yet there is this kind of restlessness that natural systems have, you know, and sadly, you know, with the, you know, recent tsunamis in Japan, and, you know, the Hurricanes Sandy and Katrina, you know, nature has a kind of devastating restlessness, and yet we still try to build barriers, you know. And the thing is that nature is bigger than any of our barriers. And so I think the call is that if, you know, if our environment does become more unstable, you know, our winters are warmer and stranger than I remember as a kid, that I guess it's about thinking differently about our expectations of ourselves. And I guess for me that was going to the idea of of we ourselves being ecologists, that we are not isolated units that are independently either motivated or functioning. We are so contingent on our environment. Places in space, and our essence evaporates. And I guess it's everybody has their own pathway. I mean, some people are never going to stop thinking in a particular way, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that the thing about where we're at the moment is I think what we'll see is a lot of synergies, that things will become true and real, that we will start working with synthetic biologies, or even even if they're not genetically modified. Let's say the algae technology, where you've actually got living gardens of microorganisms, say within a window panel in your building. I mean, when you start to actually see these things happening and start hearing about how these creatures that are cohabiting with you are providing you food or oil, they're contributing to your kind of local economy, they're cleaning your air, all of a sudden that kind of gives you a different relationship. I think it's more like a relationship that you might have with your pet, for example, or your garden. That you feel a responsibility and engagement. And I think that the cultural changes are subtle. I don't think you can force them upon people. I think this is why design, this speculative forum, to get people's imaginations excited and curious about new possibilities. I think that's the importance of it, so that people might be able to think, what if they're you can't force people to change. It's got to come from the interior. But I think if you think about the uptake of mobile phones, 30 years ago nobody had a mobile phone. Now people can't live without them, and particularly as the Moore's law and the rate of technological advances seems to be have a huge potential to create novelty. Maybe that will be one of the contributing factors to actually us understanding that natural systems, even if they're not wild nature or romanticized nature, can actually help us work technologically too. Maybe that then starts helping us trying to read our own contributions differently.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to stop because people are trying to get into the room to listen to your talk. Thank you very much again. We'll have to do this again and schedule more time. Yes, thanks for coming.
Thank you.